Thank you for joining me. Today I want to talk about a very famous business ethics case, the case of Enron, but I'm not going to focus on Enron, the company itself. I want to focus on Enron's auditor, the accounting firm, famous accounting firm actually, Arthur Andersen. Arthur Andersen was a venerable accounting firm dating back to the early 20th century and had had many hundreds or even thousands of well-known corporate clients. So when Arthur Andersen was hired as Enron's external auditor to inspect Enron's financials, they were tasked with an important role for a major company, and they were seen as being adequate for the role because of their venerable history, and the expectations for them were very high. Now, Enron, as we all know, was engaging in a number of very aggressive kinds of accounting practices, including the aggressive use of mark-to-market accounting, as well as the deployment of special purpose entities in order to hide the true nature of their debt load. Arthur Andersen was employed by Enron just like any other external auditing firm is employed by major publicly traded companies. They were employed by Enron in order to inspect Enron's books and provide the public, that is, potential capital providers like credit providers or equity holders, provide the public with a clean bill of health, asserting that Enron was indeed a reliable uh, company with financials that backed up its assertions and so forth. This is a pretty typical relationship between a large publicly traded company and an external auditing firm. Audits of the kind that Arthur Andersen was employed to engage in usually involve numerous different accountants, and they can often take a long period of time. At any rate, Enron hired Arthur Andersen from Enron's perspective so as to offer the public assurance that Enron's financials were indeed trustworthy and accurate. And Arthur Andersen, from their perspective, entered into the relationship with Enron uh, in order to, first of all, of course, obtain client business, but secondly, in order to ascertain whether or not Enron was accurately stating its various different assets, its various different revenue streams, and so forth. From the perspective of the external auditor, it is imperative that the external auditor be as impartial as possible in a process of this kind, so as not to come to see things management's way in a manner that ultimately might lead to signing off on corrupt practices. Now, Arthur Andersen was, over the years, they became very chummy with Enron. They knew Enron better than perhaps any other uh, client that worked with Enron, client as an auditing firm. They knew Enron backwards and forwards, and Enron recognized this, and over time they began to offer Arthur Andersen, all of this went down in the late 1990s, they began to offer Arthur Andersen various different uh, opportunities to serve as a consulting firm. Now, there are lots of venerable consulting firms. McKinsey, for instance, is a venerable consulting firm. And consulting firms, when they are employed by large publicly traded companies, are there so as to improve the operations of the publicly traded company. An example of this might be a consulting firm that finds inefficiencies in the operations of a publicly traded company and that provides management for the company with advice as to how to eliminate those inefficiencies and streamline operations. Now, an auditing firm and a consulting firm play two very, very different roles in the corporate world. An auditing firm plays a role that is mostly akin to that of a referee in a sports match. The referee is supposed to call things impartially, not to be biased towards one team or another. not to be biased towards a team that, say, pays him under the table. A consulting firm, by contrast, is not supposed to be impartial in its operations. It's supposed to be an advocate. It is supposed to act on behalf of the client for the sake of the client's best interests so as to improve the business operations of the client. Arthur Andersen in the late 1990s was employed by Enron in two different capacities which ultimately led to a conflict of interest, one that was fatal for the firm. The two different capacities were: one, Arthur Andersen was serving as a referee, a corporate referee, as an external auditor, and two, Arthur Andersen was functioning also at the same time as an advocate, acting on behalf of the company for the sake of the betterment or improvement of the company's operations. Now, this dual role structure led to conflicts of interest. A conflict of interest is a circumstance in which one is playing two roles which obstruct each other. Playing one role well prevents one from playing the other role well. Playing the other role prevents one from playing the one. If I were, say, a human resources manager, and if I were tasked with finding the best employee for an open position, and out of all the applicants, I find an application from my cousin, and my cousin may not be the best qualified candidate for the position. My cousin may not be most likely to improve the company's prospects if he were given the position. But because he is my cousin, I, as a human resources manager, choose to hire him. This is an example of a conflict of interest. A conflict of interest is when I, as employee of the company, am tasked with finding the best person for the job. But I also, as relative to my cousin, want to give my cousin the job. I cannot play both roles simultaneously in a successful way. The roles conflict with each other. The interests of the roles are in conflict. Just as I, as a human resources manager hiring my cousin, might face a conflict of interest, so also Arthur Andersen faced a conflict of interest when it was tasked with being both at the same time an external auditor, a referee role, and also a consulting firm, which is an advocate role. Arthur Andersen did not want to lose Enron's business. Enron was a very large client. And so when it became evident to them that Enron was in fact acting fraudulently, massive fraud was being committed at Enron, Arthur Andersen faced a choice as an accounting firm. It could sign off on Enron's books, tell the public that those financials at Enron were healthy as stated, and that Enron indeed had assets to cover their debts, had the kinds of assets that they claimed that they had, and so on and so forth. Or it could cut off the relationship with Enron, even perhaps go public with its findings, but certainly lose Enron as a client and cut off the relationship for the sake of maintaining its integrity as an auditing firm. Arthur Andersen chose to maintain its client relationship with Enron. They overlooked the massive fraud. They chose to sign off and tell the public that Enron's financials were trustworthy. They signed off on management's fraudulent behavior, and ultimately this led to the public being thoroughly deceived for some years in the late 1990s prior to Enron's collapse in the technology crash and subsequent recession. And it led to enormous financial losses for a lot of people who didn't know any better. Now, I want to make a couple final comments about this particular case, especially focusing on Arthur Andersen's operations. First of all, one comment that I want to make is that fraud can often go undetected for a long period of time. Arthur Andersen's support for Enron's fraudulent activities proceeded for some years, many years in fact, before finally being exposed in a recession. Warren Buffett, the famous American businessman, is fond of saying that in a recession, the tide goes out and you can see who's been swimming naked. And indeed, when a recession happens, it's very, very difficult to sustain fraudulent operations for a long period of time. And in fact, Enron was very quickly exposed. Arthur Andersen was also exposed, and I'll tell you guys what happened momentarily. But for now, a second point that I want to make finally about Arthur Andersen is that an accounting firm that does external audits has a certain amount of trust as its capital. In fact, its trust is perhaps its most valuable asset. If the public trusts the accounting firm and its honesty, then the public will trust the accounting firm's assertions that the client's books are indeed as the client says that they are, and the assets of the client are indeed what the accounting firm and what the client represents them as being. If an accounting firm that is conducting external audits loses its trust from the public, then it will very quickly collapse as an accounting firm, because no one from the public will believe the accounting firm's assertions, and no clients, potential corporate clients that is, will want to hire the accounting firm, because they will all see that accounting firm as untrustworthy and not the kind of an accounting firm that they would want so as to back up their particular corporate statements. It's not an accounting firm that would bring about trust if it were indeed to be hired as a client auditor. Now, final comments about Arthur Andersen. The collapse of Enron led to the collapse of Arthur Andersen as well. An accounting firm that can't be trusted is not going to get new business. And when Enron went down, potential clients all dumped Arthur Andersen, refused to do business with them. And a venerable accounting firm, which employed tens of thousands of accountants around the world, collapsed in very short order, putting many people out of jobs and leading to a variety of scandals and various legal ramifications, civil suits, criminal suits, and so forth. Interestingly, Arthur Andersen also at the same time, prior to the tech crash in and around the period of 2000, they were also the auditor for the WorldCom scandal, which was a similar sort of freewheeling scandal, although the actual machinations engaged in by Bernie Ebbers and similar executives in that scandal were slightly different than what was going on in the Enron case. But Arthur Andersen signed off in both cases on fraudulent books, and this collapse in trust led to Arthur Andersen's collapse as an accounting firm. The upshot of this case is that it is imperative that accounting firms have and cultivate trust in the public and on the part of potential clients. It is imperative also that in business, not just for accounting firms, in business, one not put oneself in a situation where one faces certain conflicts of interest, where it is impossible for one to do one's job successfully, engaging in 2 or more roles at the same time.